Well, I had read about this in the press that this team was coming out, but I'll admit that I really haven't looked at the details too much. What I'll say next is with respect to like cyclists who are getting a contract and team personnel who love cycling and are looking for a job, but it's hard. But I really don't have any time or space for the whole group of U.S. Postal American riders who doped and never made any amends for it. And by making amends for it, I don't mean, a lot of them served a quiet 6 month, suspension over the off season and maybe missed a few cobbled classics at the start of the year. But for me, it's a matter of taking personal responsibility that if you do something. And so if let's say you're born into a family that's in the mob and you go into that line of business, you could say, hey, I was born in the mob, but it also doesn't make murder and extortion okay. And so, cyclists who, and I'm also not naive, although I was naive at the time when all of it was going on. I'm not naive at saying that if you were of that era, it was really the sports governing bodies and the whole McQuaid, and I forget the other guy who ran it with him off the top of my head, that really set that up. But it's not a victimless crime. And it's easy to say, hey, everybody was doing it, so I can do it. And that's one way of saying it. But it doesn't mean that there weren't people that didn't dope that basically had to quit cycling. And I know this because towards the end of the 90s, one of my best friends who was a really top level amateur cyclist, he had a barbecue. He lived up in the Bay Area. He was working for a tech company, and I was up there hanging out. And a cyclist who KS was of our generation, maybe a couple years younger, and I'm not going to bring up his name because he never brought anything up. But he was an American and he was racing. He had gone through all the steps. He was more of an all-arounder climber, and he was at the barbecue. And I rapped with him for a little bit. Hey, how's it going? All that, but not a whole lot. But I just noticed kind of this look in his eyes that looked like, his dog died or just had that look like something, had gone wrong. And I remember talking to my best friend about it afterwards. And I'm like, what was up with, this guy? And he just told me that it was the end of the season and the team that he was on just came to him and just said, hey, if you don't get on a doping program, you're not going to get a contract. And he didn't dope. And that was the end of his cycling career. And so I think for all these athletes, and this includes, guys who you watch on the tour like Christian Vandeveld, I'm not saying that they didn't have a decision to make, but to make that decision and never come out afterwards for the next generation of cyclists and say, we made these decisions, but there were also negative impacts to people. I just don't have any time for them. And, might not be a popular opinion with some people, but that's my opinion. And I think if you're being touted as fostering the next generation of cyclists, I don't think having somebody, at the top of it who's, refuses to accept responsibility for their actions and how it could have hurt people is just a positive image going forward. So I don't know if that means I'm just don't really care ever about it, but I would have loved to have seen all of those guys who were on Postal and admitted they testified and came out and they served their short bans, a lot of them. But if they would have come out and said, hey, you know what? There were a lot of negative consequences to this. So we're all going to take just a little bit of all this money we made, because let's be honest, it came down to money. If you didn't dope, you were either not going to get a contract, you were going to make a little bit of money and probably go out through the bottom end of cycling. And if you doped, then you could make a lot of money and get the publicity and have a TV commentator job. Take a little bit of that money you earned off your decision to dope and put it into a fund that would educate and help foster juniors coming along. You can say what you want about Floyd and all of his, how he handled his tour positive test and everything that he did after that. But at the end of the day, he did end up with about a $750,000 in his pocket after his whole whistleblower lawsuit, and he didn't keep it. He put it into a cycling team and sponsored them and didn't take that money. But I didn't see any of the other guys ever really owning their decisions.
Well, what an honest take that you're presenting, and it's an important topic. It's so easily brushed over. We're kind of in an era of a lot of cyclists just don't care about the doping time. They don't
Right.
understand it. They see Dr. Peter Attia interviewing Lance, and Lance going, "Yeah, I rode the Madone and da 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 da, and my watts per kilogram was 6.8, and
Right.
and they're like, wow, Lance was a stud, and I don't know, it's just we're in a different era, and I think it's important to continue this conversation. I think there's some really good souls on this team. Um,
Yeah.
I don't know what to think about Alex House. He's one of the directors. He's a smart cat and an interesting character. And some of the writers, Sam Boardman is a tried and true American pro, probably a clean writer, and um, we're in a different era, and there's some good guys on that team that I like seeing getting a contract.
Absolutely.
But it's important to continue this conversation and not brush over it. We grew up in an era where Eddie Merckx was probably doping. I don't think Lamond was doing too much, but Lamond has been quite a champion for clean riding. But you know, um, I can remember when Scott Speaks tested positive, and you and I,
Yep.
and we'd all just finished racing with him at Super Week and being tortured by him, and then he
Yeah.
tested positive. So
Steve
we
speaks.
we we yeah,
Steve speaks. Yeah.
Steve speaks. Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
No, just to clarify for people so they can look it up.
Yeah. Yeah, but you're correct. And I'm not going to say, people might say, oh, it's a naive opinion, right? Because everybody was doing it and that's the way that the sport was set up. And I even over time, and I want to say this to give the opposite viewpoint, when all of this had come out, whatever, 10, 15 years ago now, and people would ask me about it. And I actually had an argument that defended in a way the people that made the decision to dope. And I'll say two things about that is, let's say you're in high school and you decide you want to be a doctor, a medical doctor, right? You want to be whatever family doctor. You're like, this is my dream. I want to take care of people. So you go out, you go to medical school, which is going to be 6 to 8 years. You got a ton of debt. You come out, you set up your office. You're like, man, this is my dream, right? I'm going to be working as a doctor. Wow, this is a lot of money. I'm trying to chip away at my debt. And maybe 6 months into your career as a doctor, you get a visit by some guy and he says, hey, I hate to break this to you, but it's really impossible right now to turn a profit as a doctor. Everybody makes up fake clients and bills and scams a little money off the top. And if you don't do it, you're going to go out of business. Your kids aren't going to be able to, go to the school that you wanted to pick for them. And if people who are doctors were faced with that decision, I could see a lot of them probably would have gone, man, let me go talk to this guy who's been a doctor for 15 years. And you go and talk to him in confidence. He says, yeah, sorry to tell you, but it's the same thing, right? How many people would have said, well, you know what, if everybody's doing it, I'm going to do it too. But it doesn't mean that, like I said, that it's a victimless crime, and I understand that it's a business decision. If people remember Oscar Kamenzen, he was world champion, I believe, in '03, and he ended up getting busted for doping back before there was any real, sanctions or criminal sanctions for it. And he gave the most basic, honest explanation. He just said, look, in the sport right now, he goes, I was given a decision. If I didn't take EPO and do all that, I'd make maybe 60 grand a year. He goes, who knows how long I would have been in the sport, and I would have gone out the bottom, never win any races. He goes, or I could dope and make, at that point, several $100,000 a year, win big races and bonuses. And he said, I made the decision, I got caught, and now my career's over. But, that was his decision to make. And so I'm not naive in thinking that it wasn't a tough decision for people to make. And I could understand that if you have a dream and you want to be in it and you get in and all of a sudden you realize the system is corrupt, you have a decision to make. But like I said, I also think that there's negative consequences of that. And for all of those riders who are part of that to never just own it and come out and be frank for it, I think is doing frank about it is doing a real disservice to the next generation of riders, because you're kind of saying, hey, don't own it, sweep it under the rug, and look at me, I made all this money, and now I, have folklore in the sport of cycling. I just don't think that that's the message that you want to give to the next generation of riders coming up.
What do you think about Chris Carmichael?
I think he never got caught as a coach. But there's a lot of redacted information about him, and, built an empire on, blanking on his CTS, in doing that. And he was able to skate through. A lot of people did that, and like I said, he never got sanctioned. So can you say that he did it for sure? No, if there's never any proof about it. But I think, again, all those people of that generation, if you don't ever come out and say, hey, we made decisions based on pressure or whatever to do it, and here's some of the consequences of it, then how does the next generation learn? How do you effectively lead in that position? What do you guys think?
Well, it's an important moment. We got modern adventure queuing up. What do you think, Kurt?
Kind of, it comes, a big part of it, I feel, is it comes down to the broken model of sponsorship being the major funding of cycling. And cycling has always struggled for money, especially at that level, right? Like at the Pro Conti level. So anytime any money comes in, however little or great it sounds, people oftentimes decide to just kind of look the other way because the money's here, and everybody jumps on top of it. And an example I like to think about in that is rock racing. If you all remember the rock racing team and rock racing jeans, and right, I mean, they hired at that point Santiago Botero and who's the guy still racing the Colombian that's like 50, races the Tour of Gila every year. They
Right.
hired Tyler
Mancebo.
Francesco Mancebo. They just openly hired a bunch of convicted dopers. The guy who ran that company, Michael Ball, if I remember the name correctly, he was not necessarily an outstanding individual. But people were willing to look the other way because this little bit of money was coming into the sport, of a sport that's so starved for money. So I think that's part of what's going on with this new thing. I know George.
Well,
I don't
one
know
one
George
thing
real
about
well. Yeah,
oh, I was just
yeah,
gonna say one thing about rock racing was they did rock and roll cycling, which it needed to be rock and rolled. Michael Marks has
yeah.
come in and rock and roll cycling with BWR, but rock racing did a good job of, you know, they brought some grit, some rock and roll, some good
Right.
marketing.
Some
Yeah,
flair.
they did that. I mean, right down to the rattle canned bikes, right? Remember the riders were painting their own frames and doing that because they didn't have a
Oh,
sponsor.
really?
But yeah, I mean, there was all sorts of different stuff. But ultimately, I think that also was a distraction too from what other stuff was going on. And my point is that people in cycling often choose to look the other way because, oh gosh, there's a little bit of money. I mean, this is like, we haven't had a U.S. team for a while. I mean, other than Team Type 1, I think they're still Team Type 1. Like, they've been a Conti team for 20 years or something now, and doing that. But other than that, like, we haven't had a U.S. team. And so people are so hungry for it, they are willing to, like I said, look the other way, which is unfortunate. So I do believe, if we can bring that to light a little bit and just bring some clarity to it and maybe offer a different perspective, I think that can be helpful. And
Yeah.
I think it was you said, DS. It's like, oh, these young writers, they don't, or no, Ed, you said they don't even know or they don't care. But it's like, how can you know where you're going if you didn't know where you came from? So hopefully a little bit of even the storytelling that we're doing and offering some perspective of similar situations can be helpful.
Right.
Yeah, well, I'm
And we'll,
proud of us for bringing it up. I think we should lean
Yeah.
into it more.